Have you ever heard of a miracle that happened after a prophet's death? Imagine someone being resurrected just by touching bones. It sounds like a movie scene, but it's in the Bible. Today, we're diving into Elisha's last miracle, a mind-blowing event that defies logic and proves that God's power knows no limits. Stay with me until the end, because this story might change the way you see faith and miracles. In a small and peaceful village called Abel Meholah, located among the hills of the mountainous region of Israel, a young boy named Elisha was born. His family was simple, made up of farmers who worked the land with dedication. There were no riches or large estates. They lived off what the land provided, and their hands, calloused from hard labor, knew the harshness of everyday life. This was Elisha's life, a common one, with no ambitions for great deeds or fame. The field around his home was vast, with golden grain fields and some animals grazing under the clear sky. The view of the horizon seemed to offer a serene tranquility, but Elisha, although still young, felt that something great was reserved for him. He didn't know exactly what, but he had a sense that his life would have a much greater purpose than the simple routine of Abel Meholah could offer. Elisha grew up like any other young man in his village, taking care of the oxen, helping his parents plow the land, and harvesting the fruits of their labor. However, when he looked at the vast and open sky, he felt something beyond his earthly reality. He didn't know it yet, but God had already started to chart his path, and his story was about to be written in an extraordinary way. Elisha's story did not begin with a miraculous birth, nor with a priestly or royal lineage, as with other great names in the Bible. On the contrary, he was an ordinary man with a dedicated and simple heart, a true reflection of how God chooses to use the most unlikely people to fulfill his greatest plans. His name, Elisha, which means God is salvation, was not just any name. It was a prophecy, a reflection of the vital role he would play in the life of the people of Israel. He would be God's instrument to bring miracles, healing, and deliverance. Still young, Elisha had no idea that he would become the next great prophet of Israel, the successor to Elijah, the man whose name echoed among the most powerful and respected of his time. But the divine purpose, silently and precisely, was preparing to take shape. As the sun set over the fields of Abel Meholah, Elisha's life would continue its course, but something beyond human understanding was about to happen, and he would soon understand that his life would be completely transformed. It was an ordinary morning when something extraordinary happened. Elisha, with his hands dirty from working in the field, was leading his oxen, as he did every day. The sound of the hooves hitting the ground, the fresh morning air, and the silence of the fields were all he knew. But at that moment, he would be pulled from his routine life into a destiny he could never have imagined. On the horizon, an imposing figure appeared, Elijah, the great prophet, whose deeds and miracles had echoed throughout Israel. He walked with a firmness that conveyed authority, and his mantle, made of animal skins, swayed gently in the wind. Many knew of Elijah's fame, but Elisha, at that moment, could never have imagined that this man would be the turning point in his life. The prophet Elijah said nothing, but his gaze was penetrating, as if he knew something Elisha had yet to understand. Then, without warning, Elijah approached and, without saying a word, threw his mantle over Elisha's shoulders. The gesture, simple and silent, carried deep meaning and a direct calling from God. Elijah's mantle, worn by him throughout his prophetic life, was now transferred to Elisha, symbolizing the passing of the responsibility to prophesy over Israel. The moment was brief, but filled with power. Elisha, astonished, stood still, Elijah's mantle falling over him like a heavy cloak of responsibility and divine power. He knew this gesture was not ordinary. It was a message that God himself was choosing him for a much greater mission. But what did this mean? What was he supposed to do now? He looked at the prophet, but Elijah was already walking away, continuing his journey, as if knowing his part was done. Elisha felt a whirlwind inside him. It was not just a simple exchange of mantles, it was the divine calling. He was being chosen, not just to follow Elijah, but to continue something much greater, something that would not be confined to the simple life he knew. Elisha knew that from that moment, his life would never be the same. The God of Israel had a plan for him, a plan he didn't fully understand yet, but that was beginning to be revealed in that silent and powerful gesture. The sun was beginning to hide behind the mountains, and the field, now peaceful, seemed to reflect the turmoil in Elisha's heart. The mantle on his shoulders, heavy with the weight of the calling, seemed to burn on his skin, as if he already felt the responsibility it entailed. With each step he took toward his old life, the thoughts swirled in his mind. He was being called, but to what exactly? The doubt was great, but something stronger within him urged him not to hesitate, not to question what God had already determined. For a moment, Elisha looked at the oxen, which were patiently grazing on the same land he had cared for so many years. He looked at the plow, his work tools, the only things he knew so well. Those simple objects had been his life, his source of livelihood, his way of existence. But as he watched, a sense of urgency filled him. He knew, without a doubt, that the life he knew no longer had a place for him. With a determination that would surprise even the bravest, Elisha made an instant decision. He turned to the oxen, cut the yoke with force, took the plow, and without hesitation, made a symbolic gesture of farewell. He burned the plow and sacrificed the oxen. The smoke rose to the sky as a clear sign that from now on, he would not turn back. The decision was made. He could no longer cling to the simple, secure life he had led until then. With that act of renunciation, Elisha was declaring that there was no turning back, that his journey would be entirely dedicated to the mission God had placed before him. He no longer needed material security, for his destiny was in something much bigger and grander. God was calling him to be a prophet, and this calling demanded total commitment. So, with his eyes fixed on the horizon and his heart steadfast, Elisha followed Elijah. The gesture of renouncing the past and moving forward into the future was perhaps the most significant of his life. He knew there was no turning back, and something profound was ignited within him. He was ready for whatever came, with the confidence of one who knows that, with God by his side, the impossible would become possible. With Elijah's mantle on his shoulders and a mission that seemed greater than he could understand, Elisha followed his master. The journey that was now beginning would not only be physical, but spiritual. By Elijah's side, he began to understand the true depth of the calling God had for him. It was not just a task, but a process of transformation. The relationship between them would become an unbreakable bond, where learning, miracles, and challenges would shape Elisha into the man of faith God intended. Elisha was not just a passive follower. He watched every move Elijah made with the attentive eyes of a disciple hungry for knowledge. Every word spoken by Elijah was absorbed, and every miracle performed by the prophet made him question how God operated so powerfully. Elisha knew his journey wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to absorb everything he could to be prepared for the future that awaited him. The relationship between the two prophets was more than a simple master-disciple dynamic. It was a sacred partnership. Elijah did not see Elisha as just an assistant, but as a true heir to his mission. He knew the young man walking beside him had something special, something God had placed in him since birth. And Elisha, in turn, looked at Elijah with reverence and admiration, seeing in him not just a mentor, but a model of obedience and unwavering faith. In moments of calm, Elijah shared with Elisha stories of the past, accounts of how God had worked in his life, and how he had performed great feats through him. But among these stories, Elijah also imparted valuable lessons on humility, courage, and the need to trust fully in God. Elisha, for his part, didn't just listen, but began to imitate. He saw in Elijah the reflection of God himself, a man who cared nothing for glory or praise, but only for fulfilling God's will. Elisha understood that, more than performing miracles or having a grand mission, he needed to have a pure heart, an absolute trust in the Lord, and be willing to pay the price for obedience to God. Each day spent alongside Elijah, Elisha grew. He became spiritually stronger, more capable, and increasingly aware that his mission was drawing closer. Their relationship was a silent but intense preparation. Elijah knew his journey was nearing its end, and the time to pass the mantle to Elisha was approaching. But for Elisha, every day with Elijah was a gift. He knew he was living through historic moments, being forged not only as a prophet, but as a man of God. He understood that to be a true successor of Elijah, he would need to carry not just the physical mantle, but the depth of faith that Elijah demonstrated in every word and action. The day was nearing its end, and an indescribable feeling hung in the air. Elisha and Elijah had traveled from Bethel to Jericho, and now they were close to the Jordan River. The winds began to blow stronger, and a sacred silence settled around them, as if the entire universe was awaiting the moment that was about to unfold. Elisha felt that something extraordinary was about to be revealed, something he could not fully comprehend, but knew would mark a pivotal moment in his life and journey. Elijah, with a calm demeanor, knew his ascension was near. He had fulfilled his mission on earth, but now God was calling him to something even greater. Before crossing the Jordan, Elijah stopped and turned to Elisha, his piercing eyes fixed on the disciple. With a serene look, he asked, "What do you want me to do for you before I am taken from you?" The silence that followed was deep, filled with emotion. Elisha knew this was the moment when he should ask for something that reflected not only his personal desire, but also the depth of his mission. He took a deep breath and responded with unwavering faith, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elisha's request wasn't merely a pursuit of more power, but a desire for greater empowerment to fulfill the mission God would give him. He wanted to continue Elijah's work, but with even greater strength, a more powerful anointing. Elijah looked at him deeply and, in a gesture that seemed final, said, "You've asked a hard thing, but if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be so." Then, as they continued walking toward the banks of the Jordan, a cloud of glory descended from the sky. The wind increased, and suddenly a chariot of fire, drawn by horses of fire, appeared before them. The sight was so breathtaking that it seemed more like a celestial manifestation than something human. The chariot of fire separated Elijah from Elisha, and as the prophet was taken up to heaven, Elisha witnessed the moment of his ascension. In an instant, Elijah was lifted, ascending into the heavens, while Elisha, his eyes fixed, could not look away. A shiver ran down his spine as finally, the prophet was enveloped by the cloud and disappeared from sight. The moment was indescribable, so sublime that it seemed the very heavens had opened to take God's servant to his eternal home. With a cry, Elisha couldn't contain his emotion. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." He saw Elijah being taken, and at the same time, felt the weight of his own mission. The pain of separation was great, but the certainty that he had been chosen to continue his master's work was even greater. Looking down, Elisha saw Elijah's mantle fallen to the ground. He approached it, took it reverently, and with a heart full of faith and confidence, prepared to move forward, to walk with God's power upon him, as he had asked. The mantle he held symbolized more than the succession of a task. It represented the continuation of God's divine work, which would never cease. Elisha was now facing a new challenge. With Elijah's mantle in his hands, he felt the responsibility to carry on God's work, but also the weight of the mission he had just inherited. He knew that to prove God's presence was still with him, he needed to demonstrate his power visibly, and the test came soon after. After Elijah's ascension, Elisha made his way to the Jordan River. The gentle sound of the flowing water seemed almost like a forewarning of what was about to happen. He was there, with his master's mantle in his hands, not exactly knowing what he would do next, but certain he needed to act. He approached the water, looked at it, and with firm faith asked, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" At that very moment, Elisha took Elijah's mantle and struck it against the surface of the river. What followed was nothing short of an astonishing miracle. The waters of the Jordan parted, opening a dry path in the middle of the river, as if the very earth had obeyed the divine command. Elisha advanced, crossing the river on dry ground, and those who were watching were astounded. This first miracle of Elisha was not only a demonstration of God's power, but also a clear sign that he had been chosen to continue Elijah's mission. The Jordan River, which had parted before Moses and later before Joshua, now opened once again, but this time through Elisha. The crowd that witnessed the miracle, likely in shock, soon recognized that the God of Elijah was now with Elisha. The men who had accompanied him, witnessing the event, understood that Elijah's anointing had not failed, but had passed on to the new prophet. Elisha, with humility, knew this demonstration wasn't for his glory, but to glorify God's name and show the people of Israel that he continued to perform miracles, even after Elijah's departure. As Elisha crossed the Jordan, he felt a peace that could only come from full trust in the Lord. He now knew that God was with him, just as he had been with Elijah. From that moment on, he felt ready to move forward, to fulfill the call of prophet with courage and determination, knowing that God's power would sustain him. Elisha's story had begun with the vision of the chariot of fire, but now, with this first miracle, he was beginning to write his own journey of faith, in which miracles would be merely the reflection of what God wanted to do in the lives of his people. And with that, Elisha's legacy gained strength, and he prepared for what was to come. Elisha's journey was just beginning, and with each step, he faced challenges that tested his faith and his ability to be the leader God had called him to be. After the remarkable miracle at the Jordan, he made his way to the city of Jericho, which wasn't too far away. Jericho, a historically significant city, however, had a serious problem. its waters were contaminated. The people of Jericho were suffering because the bitter and impure waters were contaminating both the fields and the health of its inhabitants. The plants wouldn't grow, the land wasn't producing what it should, and the people's bodies bore the weight of a life marked by the lack of clean water. The suffering was palpable. The city was on the brink of collapse, and the people turned to Elisha for a divine solution. When Elisha arrived in the city, he was greeted by a group of elders and local leaders who, with concerned faces, told him about the state of the waters. They were desperate, but they knew that if anyone could bring about a change, it was Elisha, the prophet of God. They led him to the spring, a vital place for the city's life. Elisha, with surprising calmness, asked them to bring a new jar and salt. The prophet knew that the solution wasn't in human methods, but in an act of faith in God's power. He took the salt, and with a simple gesture, threw it into the water, declaring, "Thus says the Lord, I will purify these waters. They will no longer cause death or infertility." What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. In a matter of moments, the water began to purify. Where once there had been a bitter and harmful substance, now the water was crystal clear, flowing as if the land had been healed. The city of Jericho, which had suffered for so long from the impurity of its waters, was restored by a divine miracle. The people of Jericho, who had once lost hope, were filled with joy and gratitude. They witnessed that God not only healed physically, but also restored the balance and harmony of creation. The purification of the waters was not just a physical healing miracle, but a powerful symbol of God's transformative power. Elisha once again demonstrated that his authority came from God, and that he was not just a messenger of the Lord, but an instrument of his direct action in the world. The elders and leaders of the city, recognizing the greatness of this miracle, committed to following the prophet's teachings with greater devotion, knowing that the word of God indeed had the power to transform any situation, no matter how desperate. This event became a milestone in Elisha's life, showing that his mission was not just about performing extraordinary miracles, but restoring divine order in everyday situations, thus leading the people of Israel to understand God's care and mercy. After performing the miracle of the waters of Jericho, Elisha continued his journey through Israel, gaining more and more respect, but also facing opposition. God's power manifested through him in extraordinary ways, and as always happens with prophets, there were those who did not understand or respect his mission. Upon arriving in the city of Bethel, Elisha encountered a group of young men, seemingly carefree and even irreverent. These youths, with disrespectful attitudes, began to mock Elisha. They called him Baldy, cruelly and irreverently insulting his appearance. While it seemed like a mere jest, the act had much deeper meaning. They were mocking not only Elisha, but the authority of God that he represented. Elisha, instead of responding with aggressive words or anger, looked at them with the wisdom that only a prophet of God could have. He knew it wasn't him, but God himself who was being dishonored by their behavior. So, with deep faith in the Lord and a firm spirit, Elisha cursed them, saying, "In the name of the Lord, let these children be punished." In that very instant, 2 great bears came out of the forest and attacked the mocking youths, injuring them severely. Fear spread throughout the city, and the irreverent behavior of the youths quickly turned into terror. The lesson was clear and immediate. Mocking the authority of God had serious consequences. This event, though striking and dark, served as a powerful sign to the people of Israel. Elisha was not just an ordinary man, but a prophet of God, and anyone who disrespected him was challenging divine authority. The bears, in their uncontrollable strength, not only punished the youths, but also taught that the Lord does not allow his authority to be dishonored without consequence. This episode was etched in the memory of the people of Israel, and the story spread as a reminder of how serious God's calling is and the need for reverence before him. For Elisha, it was a moment to reaffirm his role as the bearer of God's word, not only through miracles, but also through the manifestation of divine judgment. Although the episode was tragic for the youths who mocked him, it was a teaching opportunity for all who witnessed it, showing that God is not someone to be disregarded. His authority is sovereign, and those who respect him will be blessed, while those who challenge him will face the consequences of their actions. The kingdom of Israel was often at war, and the enemies were varied, but among the most notorious were the Moabites, who frequently challenged Israel's dominion. During a period of great tension, Israel joined forces with its allies, Judah and Edom, to face Moab in a decisive battle. The king of Israel, Jehoram, knew that without God's help, victory would be unlikely. He, therefore, sought the guidance of Elisha, the prophet who had already distinguished himself with many miracles. When Elisha was called to help, he knew the situation wouldn't be easy. The Israelite, Judean, and Edomite armies were marching through the desert, and the most urgent issue was the lack of water. The troops were exhausted, and the relentless heat of the desert was beginning to take its toll. Without water, both the men and the animals were on the brink of death. Desperation overtook the commanders, and they cried out for a miracle. Elisha, realizing the gravity of the situation, didn't hesitate. He asked for a musical instrument to be brought, and as the sound of music played, the Spirit of God descended upon him, giving him a word of hope. The prophet spoke with authority. "Dig ditches in the desert, and God will provide water." The order seemed absurd. How could there be water in an arid and lifeless desert? Still, the soldiers followed Elisha's instruction and began digging the ditches. Throughout the night, there were no signs of rain, no clouds in the sky. Hope was almost gone, but the prophet knew that God's power wasn't limited by natural laws. The next morning, to everyone's surprise, the ditches were filled with water. There was no rain, no wind, but the ditches were overflowing with the liquid the soldiers so desperately needed. The Lord, in His mercy, had provided for His people. Not only that, but the water that appeared also confused the Moabites. When they looked at the field where the armies were camped, the reflection of the sun on the water made the ditches look like pools of blood. The Moabites, seeing this, thought the allied armies had slaughtered each other and decided to attack. But when they arrived at the field, they found the Israelites ready for battle. The victory was resounding. With divine help, the Moabites were defeated, and Israel emerged victorious. The miracle of water was not only an act of God's mercy to save the people from thirst, but also a way to confuse the enemies and secure Israel's victory. This event became a reminder that, when circumstances seem impossible and hope seems to have run out, God can provide a miraculous solution. Elisha, as God's instrument, once again demonstrated that obedience to His instructions can turn a desperate situation into an unexpected victory. In a time of great scarcity and hardship, Elisha found himself facing a situation that reflected the daily struggle of many: the fight for survival. A widow, desperate, sought the prophet's help. She was about to lose her children due to a debt she couldn't pay. The creditor was determined to take her children as slaves, as she had nothing else to offer in exchange. The widow, with a heart full of anguish, shared her situation with Elisha. Her gaze reflected a mixture of desperation and hope, for she knew this man, known for his miracles, might be her family's last hope. Elisha, sensing the gravity of her plea, looked at her with compassion and asked, "What do you have in the house?" The woman, with a sad expression, replied, "Nothing, except a small jar of oil." It was then that Elisha, inspired by the Spirit of God, gave her an unusual instruction. "Go to your neighbors and ask for empty vessels, as many as you can find. Then, shut the door behind you and begin pouring oil into the vessels you have." Though the woman had little strength to believe in a miracle, she obeyed without question. The oil that seemed scarce and insufficient began to flow into an abundant supply. The woman followed Elisha's guidance, going from house to house, gathering every vessel she could. When she returned home, with the vessels full and her heart pounding, she began to pour the oil. At first, it seemed like an endless task, but to her surprise, the oil didn't stop flowing. Each vessel she filled became a vessel of unexpected blessings. The miracle happened right before her eyes, and the oil kept flowing until all the vessels were full. When the last vessel was filled, the flow of oil ceased. Elisha then instructed the woman to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and still have enough left to live on with her children. The miracle not only saved the woman from financial ruin, but also brought restoration and relief in the midst of the crisis. This oil miracle, though simple, was a clear demonstration of God's power to provide, even in the most desperate situations. The widow, who initially saw herself with no options, became a witness to a miracle that not only changed her immediate situation, but also strengthened her faith in divine providence. Moreover, the story of the oil spread quickly, and many others began to believe that, when all seemed lost, God still had the power to transform little into much. The widow's trust in God, obedience, and unwavering faith became an example to all who heard the story. During his journey through the land, Elisha often passed through the town of Shunem, where he was welcomed by a wealthy and generous woman. Upon realizing that the prophet always passed by, she decided to prepare a room in her house, so that he could rest whenever he was passing through. This hospitality did not go unnoticed by Elisha, and he desired to repay her in some way. When he asked what he could do for her, the woman humbly responded that she needed nothing, as she already had everything she required. However, feeling the prompting of the Spirit of God, Elisha asked his servant Gehazi to inquire if the woman wanted any special favor. Gehazi revealed that, although the woman was wealthy and well-established, she had no children, and her husband was advanced in age. Upon hearing this, Elisha had a clear vision of what he should do. He called the woman and in a calm voice declared, "By this time next year, you will have a son in your arms." The woman, surprised and moved by the promise, responded with disbelief. "No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your servant." She was aware of her age and her situation, and having a child seemed like an impossible dream. But Elisha, with the authority of a prophet of God, did not hesitate. The promise was made, and in time, the miracle was realized. 1 year later, the woman, now with a radiant face full of joy, gave birth to a son. The smile of happiness on her face was proof that what seems impossible to God is simply an opportunity to demonstrate His power. The birth of the child was a moment of great celebration for the woman and her husband, who finally experienced the blessing that had seemed out of reach. Once again, Elisha demonstrated that God's goodness knows no bounds, and that faith and hospitality have the power to open the doors to divine blessings. But, as with every story of faith, this one would also come with tests that would challenge the woman's trust in God. The miracle of having a child was, without a doubt, one of the greatest moments of joy in the Shunammite woman's life. However, like many stories of faith, the journey would not be without difficulties. The boy grew healthy and strong, but one day, while in the field with his father, he began to complain of a severe headache. His father, concerned, sent him back to the house, where his mother quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. The woman, distressed, realized that her son was unconscious, and soon his small body was taken by death. With a broken heart and not knowing what to do, she made a desperate but faith-filled decision. Instead of crying in front of her son or mourning her loss, she quickly placed the boy in the room where she had previously received Elisha's promise and shut the door, determined not to accept the end of her story. Without wasting time, she asked her husband for a donkey, saying she was going to see the prophet. The man, not understanding the gravity of the situation, asked if everything was well. She calmly replied, "It is well." This silence in her response was an expression of unwavering faith, as she knew that only the prophet could bring a solution to her suffering. She quickly traveled to the mountain where Elisha was, and when she saw him from a distance, he recognized her immediately. Elisha sent Gehazi to ask if everything was well with her and her family. She firmly replied that all was well, for she knew that only the prophet could bring an answer to her suffering. Touched by her determination and faith, Elisha asked Gehazi to go ahead and use his staff to touch the boy's body. However, Elisha knew that only his actual presence and prayer could bring the boy back to life. He quickly descended the mountain and went to the Shunammite woman's house. Upon entering the room, Elisha lay on the boy, placing his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on the boy's eyes, his hands on the boy's hands. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening, but then, miraculously, the boy's body began to warm. Elisha got up, walked around the room, and lay on the boy again. This time, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The Shunammite woman, who was watching from the other side of the door, saw the great transformation, and when her son was returned to life, the joy could not be contained. The prophet, in a calm voice, handed the boy back to his mother's arms, and she, with tears of gratitude, prostrated herself at Elisha's feet, recognizing the greatness of God. This miracle not only restored the boy's life, but also renewed the faith of all who heard the story. The Shunammite woman, who had lost hope, now experienced the reality of a God who brings life even where there is no longer any hope. In a time of great hardship, when the land was struck by famine and food scarcity was a cruel reality, Elisha found himself with a group of young prophets. The situation was critical, and they, in great need, decided to prepare a simple meal to satisfy the hunger consuming them. One of the prophets, with good intentions, went out into the field to gather herbs for the soup. However, he came across unfamiliar plants that, unknowingly, he gathered and brought back to the group. As the soup was prepared and the prophets began to eat, something strange happened. One of the men took a bite and immediately tasted the bitter and dangerous flavor of the poisonous herbs. A cry of despair spread through the group when they realized they were eating a deadly food. Fear spread quickly among them, and panic took over, as everyone knew that, without a solution, death was imminent. What seemed like a simple and well-intentioned meal had become a death sentence for them all. But Elisha, calm and confident, stood up and asked for some flour to be brought. He then threw the flour into the pot, a simple gesture but full of faith and power. When he did this, he asked for the soup to be served again. When the prophets tasted the soup, to their astonishment, it was completely purified. The poison had disappeared, and the food, once lethal, was now safe to eat. This miracle was not only an act of mercy to save the lives of the prophets, but also a clear reminder of God's power over nature and human adversity. The prophet Elisha, through a simple act of obedience and faith, demonstrated that God can transform even the bitterest of destinies into something good and nourishing. The purification of the poisoned food was a clear representation of what God can do in the most desperate situations of life. When all seems lost and death seems imminent, He has the power to restore and transform. This miracle also showed that, even in times of scarcity, God can provide and protect those who trust in Him. In a moment of great need, Elisha was with a group of 100 men who followed his teachings and trusted his guidance. Hunger was spreading throughout the land of Israel, and the scarcity of food made daily life a difficult struggle for many. A man brought Elisha a humble offering, a small sack with 20 barley loaves and a few grains. This simple gesture of generosity was all he had to offer, and it was far from enough to feed everyone. When Elisha looked at the small amount, he knew that, in human eyes, it would be useless. But for those who have faith in God, even what seems insignificant can become abundant. Elisha, with complete trust in God, said to his servant, "Give this to everyone so they can eat." The servant, surprised, questioned the feasibility of that order. He knew that the loaves were few for so many men. "How can I set this before 100 men?" he asked skeptically. But Elisha responded firmly, "Tell the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat, and there will still be leftovers." With unwavering faith, the servant began distributing the loaves among the men. As the loaves were passed from hand to hand, something amazing happened. Everyone ate until they were satisfied, and yet there were leftovers. What seemed like an impossible miracle materialized before their eyes, once again confirming that with God, scarcity is never an obstacle. This miracle of the multiplication of the loaves was more than just provision. It demonstrated God's power to turn the little into abundance, to meet the most basic needs, and to remind everyone that God does not let His people go hungry, even when resources seem scarce. Moreover, this miracle symbolically prefigured the multiplication of loaves that Jesus would perform in the New Testament. Just as Elisha used a small number of loaves to feed a large crowd, Jesus would use a small piece of bread to feed an even greater multitude. The divine power to provide for His children, even when all seems impossible, is a theme that resonates in both stories, linking Elisha's acts of faith and providence with Christ's work. The story of Elisha and the multiplication of the loaves teaches us that when we trust in God and offer what we have, even if it's little, He can transform that simple offering into something that benefits many. Faith in God is not about how much resources we have, but about being willing to trust that He can do much with what we have. Naaman was a man of great respect and power, commander of the Syrian army. His courage and skill in battle were legendary, and he had the honor of being highly esteemed by the king. However, despite all his victories, Naaman carried an unwanted mark. He suffered from leprosy. The disease, cruel and devastating, not only affected his body but also his honor and social status. Leprosy was considered a curse, something that separated men from others. Naaman, though a man of great position, knew that his disease was something he could not cure with wealth or power. But as often happens, the solution appeared when least expected. A young Israelite servant, who was serving his wife, heard of Naaman's condition and with compassion suggested a possible cure. She told her mistress about the prophet Elisha, a man of God, who could restore the commander's health. With a mix of skepticism and hope, Naaman set off for Israel, bringing wealth and gifts in an attempt to secure the miracle he so desired. When he arrived at Elisha's house, he expected the prophet to come out personally to see him, performing some grand ritual or calling on God's power in an impressive way. But instead of attending to the commander in person, Elisha sent a messenger with a simple instruction. "Go and dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and your skin will be restored." Elisha's response, simple and direct, surprised Naaman. He had expected something grand, an action befitting his position and suffering, but what he received was an apparently insignificant order. Anger began to rise within him. As a man of high status, he did not want to submit to a dirty and despised river like the Jordan. To him, it was an insult, as if the prophet were treating his pain with disdain. Naaman almost gave up, but the servants, noticing his frustration, advised him to give the prophet's order one last chance. If he had asked for something difficult, you would have done it. But he asked for something simple. Why not try? They suggested. Reluctantly, Naaman went down into the waters of the Jordan. 7 dips after beginning the immersion, something extraordinary happened. His skin, once marked by leprosy, was restored to perfection, whiter and healthier than ever. The cure, so simple and yet so powerful, occurred the moment Naaman obeyed, exactly as Elisha had instructed. Naaman, now restored, returned to Elisha, humble and full of gratitude. He recognized that God's power was with the prophet, and for that reason, he was willing to take soil from Israel as a sign of his new faith and commitment to the God of Israel. Naaman finally understood that, contrary to what he had thought, it was not his status or wealth that could guarantee his healing, but obedience to God and faith in his power. The story of Naaman and his healing in the Jordan reveals a profound lesson about humility and obedience. Often, God's answer does not come in the way we imagine, and it is in simplicity that we find the greatest power. Naaman's healing not only restored his physical health, but also transformed his heart and faith, revealing that true healing goes beyond the body, touching the soul as well. In a time of great need, Elisha was accompanied by a group of young prophets. The work was hard, and the men were together, cutting trees to build a new place to live and study God's word. The task was simple but essential, as a space needed to be created for the group to continue their ministry. While they worked near the Jordan River, one of the disciples, full of energy and determination, was cutting a tree with an axe he had borrowed. The sound of the axe cutting the trunk was constant and lively, until at the most unexpected moment, the iron of the axe slipped off and fell into the water. The disciple panicked. The axe was not his, and he knew he could not return such a valuable borrowed item without causing great loss. He became desperate and ran to Elisha, exclaiming, "Oh, my lord, the axe I borrowed fell into the water. What will I do now?" It was an embarrassing situation, and the young man didn't know what to do, feeling helpless in the face of what had happened. Elisha calmly asked where the axe had fallen, and once informed, cut a piece of wood and threw it into the water. To everyone's surprise, the iron of the axe, which should have sunk to the bottom of the river, began to float. Slowly, the axe rose to the surface, until the young prophet grabbed it with his hands. This simple yet extraordinary miracle demonstrated God's active presence, even in the most mundane details of life. Though the lost axe might seem like a trivial problem compared to Elisha's other miracles, it revealed that God cares about the simplest needs of his children, whether in work or in moments of difficulty. Elisha's act of making the axe float was not only a demonstration of God's power over nature, but also a reminder that God is present in every aspect of life, even in the most unexpected and seemingly small situations. The miracle deeply touched the young prophet, who learned that by trusting in God, even the impossible can be accomplished, no matter how insignificant or urgent the problem may seem. This miracle teaches us that, in all circumstances, we must trust in God, knowing that He takes care of us, not only in the great trials, but also in the everyday moments that often make us feel helpless. It was a time of great tension in Israel. The king of Syria, knowing of Elisha's prophetic power, had tried several times to capture the prophet, whose knowledge of the movements of the Syrian army seemed supernatural. Every time the Syrian army tried to attack Israel, Elisha warned the king, diverting the enemy forces elsewhere, thwarting the Syrian plans. The king of Syria was furious when he realized that his strategies were being exposed. Angry and perplexed, he summoned his generals and asked them to investigate what was happening. When they learned that Elisha was the one revealing their secret plans, the king ordered that the prophet be captured at any cost. One morning, while Elisha and his servant were at home, a huge Syrian army approached Dothan, the city where they were. They surrounded the city completely, like an iron net with no escape, intending to capture the prophet and put an end to his interference in military plans. Elisha's servant, upon waking up and seeing the army surrounding the city, panicked. "Alas, my lord, what are we going to do? "We are doomed," he cried out. Fear overtook him, and he could see no way out of the imminent situation. He looked around and only saw the enemy army advancing, unable to understand what could be done. However, Elisha remained calm. He looked at his servant and confidently said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant, still incredulous, probably looked at Elisha and didn't understand what he meant. How could they be safe in the face of such an overwhelming force? Then Elisha prayed to the Lord, saying, "Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." Immediately, the servant's eyes were opened, and he saw something extraordinary: a heavenly army of angels, fiery horsemen, surrounding the Syrian army. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight at the same time. The servant now saw that they were not alone but surrounded by divine protection. With a clear vision of what was happening, Elisha asked God to blind the Syrian soldiers. God granted his request, and the soldiers were instantly blinded. The enemy army, now disoriented and confused, was led by Elisha himself to the city of Samaria, where he asked for their eyes to be opened. When the Syrians realized where they were, they found themselves in the midst of Israel, not understanding how they had been brought there. Elisha then told the king of Israel not to kill them, but to feed them and let them go in peace. The king, moved by the prophet's wisdom and kindness, did exactly what Elisha had asked. He offered a great banquet to the Syrian army and then allowed them to return to their land. This was a decisive blow to the relationship between Israel and Syria, for by treating their enemies with mercy, Elisha and the king of Israel showed that Israel's true strength was not in weapons, but in faith and the power of God. This miracle not only illustrated the divine protection surrounding Elisha and his people, but also taught a valuable lesson about how God can intervene in desperate situations. He can turn fear into trust and show, even in the darkest circumstances, that he is always by our side, ready to protect and guide us. The kingdom of Israel was in a state of despair. The city of Samaria, the capital, was surrounded by Syrian forces. For weeks, the city gates were locked, and the inhabitants were suffering from a lack of food. The famine was so severe that food prices had risen astronomically, and people were beginning to resort to desperate measures to survive. The situation in Samaria was critical. The people were eating whatever they could, even things unimaginable, such as pigeon droppings and even the flesh of children, due to the extreme food scarcity. The king of Israel, deeply distressed, blamed Elisha, believing that the famine and the siege were a divine punishment. He approached the prophet and, in a moment of despair, exclaimed, "What can I do? The Lord doesn't answer us. We are doomed." Elisha, however, maintained his unwavering faith. He looked at the king with confidence and, in a resolute tone, prophesied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. Tomorrow, at this time, there will be an abundance of flour and barley in Samaria at a very low price." Everyone was incredulous. How could this be possible? The city was surrounded, and there were no signs that the situation would improve. The king, perplexed, didn't know what to say, but he knew that Elisha spoke in God's name. Meanwhile, in the Syrian camp, the situation was also tense. The Syrian soldiers were equally weakened by the lack of food and resources. It was at this moment that God intervened in an extraordinary way. During the night, he caused the Syrians to hear the sound of a great army approaching. They thought that the Egyptians and the Hittites had joined the Israelites to attack, and terrified they fled, leaving behind all their provisions, tents, and riches. The next morning, for lepers who were at the gate of Samaria, excluded and starving, decided to take a risk and go to the Syrian camp, as they had nothing left to lose. When they arrived, they found the camp completely deserted, with everything they needed: food, clothes, and even gold and silver. They, surprised and amazed, reveled in the abundance they found, and began to take everything they could carry. However, their conscience was stirred. They realized they were in a privileged position, while the people of Samaria were still suffering. They decided, therefore, to return to the city and tell what they had found. The king and the officials of Samaria, initially skeptical, sent out investigators. When they confirmed that the Syrians had indeed fled, the people of Samaria rushed to the fields, gathering what was left by the Syrians. The abundance predicted by Elisha was fulfilled spectacularly. The famine was overcome, food prices dropped drastically, and the people celebrated God's provision. This miracle was a powerful reminder that, even in the most desperate situations, God can bring solution and abundance. When it seemed there was no more hope, Elisha's prophecy was fulfilled, showing that God's power has no limits, and that with faith, even the impossible can happen. The siege of Samaria and the miracle of abundance demonstrated that divine provision never fails, and that even when resources seem scarce, God has the ability to transform the most critical situation into a source of blessings. Elisha's life was marked by many miracles and extraordinary deeds, but the time of his death was approaching. He knew that the end of his journey was near, and as always, he maintained his faith in God until the last moment. Elisha spent his last days in Israel, where he continued to teach and prophesy, helping the people and advising the king. His ministry had a great impact, and the people knew they would lose a powerful leader. Before he died, Elisha called his successor, Elisha, and instructed him on what to do after his departure. He urged him to continue his mission with courage and faith, knowing that, although he would no longer be physically present, God's power would continue to work through him. When Elisha finally passed away, the people of Israel mourned deeply. His body was buried in a tomb, but the miracle that followed shortly after his death was a clear sign that God was still working through him, even after his departure. A few years later, during a bandit attack, a group of men was burying one of their friends when suddenly they saw a great threat approaching. Desperate to flee, they threw the dead man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, something wonderful happened. The man who had been dead came back to life. He immediately stood up, full of life, and began to walk. This surprising miracle was a confirmation that God's power was not limited to Elisha's life. Even after his death, the prophet was still an instrument of God to manifest his glory and power. The resurrection of that man was a clear demonstration that, in God's plan, even death does not have the final word. Divine power transcends time and human limitations. Elisha's final miracle was a great testimony of faith for the people of Israel. Although his death was sad, it did not mean the end of his legacy. On the contrary, he continued to touch lives in ways no one could have predicted. The resurrection that occurred through his tomb was a reminder that God's presence never departs, and that he has the power to bring life where there seems to be only death. Elisha's legacy, though quiet in its simplicity, is powerful and enduring. He not only performed extraordinary miracles during his life, but also shaped the spiritual history of Israel in deep and unforgettable ways. His life was marked by unwavering obedience to God and the courage to fulfill the divine calling, no matter the challenges or adversities that arose in his path. The impact of Elisha on the people of Israel was immense. He not only interceded in times of need, but also led with an authority that reflected God's power and wisdom. His miracles were signs that God was present amidst the suffering of the people, and his actions brought not only relief but also teaching, always pointing to God's character. Among the miracles he performed, some stand out not only for the wonder they represented, but for the message they conveyed. The multiplication of oil for the widow, the healing of Naaman, and the purification of the bitter waters of Jericho. These events were more than demonstrations of power. They taught the people that God is capable of restoring, healing, and providing in any situation, big or small. Moreover, Elisha's relationship with his disciples and the king of Israel revealed his tireless dedication to God's cause. He was always ready to advise, correct, and offer solutions in God's name. His example of faithfulness and service to the Lord was an inspiration to many, both in his generation and the generations that followed. But perhaps Elisha's greatest legacy was his ability to pass on the flame of faith. He didn't just have a disciple like Elisha, but also inspired other men and women to fully trust in God's power and promises. His acts of courage in the face of the enemy, his unwavering confidence in God's words, and his willingness to act as a true prophet, regardless of the difficulties, left a testimony that would echo for centuries. The end of his life was not the end of his impact. The resurrection of the man who touched his bones after his death is a clear testimony that Elisha's legacy was not limited to the time he spent on earth. His name and actions continued to be a symbol of faith, power, and dedication to God. The power of God that worked in his life did not cease with his death, and his example endured as a lesson that faithfulness to God and trust in his sovereignty will always be rewarded. Elisha's legacy, therefore, goes beyond miracles and powerful deeds. He is a symbol of obedience, definitive faith, and a deep commitment to the divine calling. His life continues to inspire all those who seek to live with purpose and in harmony with God's will, reminding us that, like Elisha, we can be instruments of divine power, even in the most challenging circumstances. The story of Elisha, with his miracles and lessons of faith, continues to resonate today, offering a clear example of how God works powerfully and personally in the lives of those who follow him with obedience and courage. In an era marked by uncertainties and challenges, Elisha's life offers not only hope but also a model to follow. His story teaches us deep lessons about trust in God, the importance of living according to his principles, and how he cares for us in all aspects of life, whether in great moments of crisis or in the small, everyday matters. Today, we often find ourselves in situations that seem impossible, just as the people of Israel did in Elisha's time. Scarcity of resources, challenges in relationships, illness, and financial difficulties can make us feel as though we are alone in a sea of problems. However, when we look at Elisha's life, we see a clear example that God never abandons those who sincerely seek him. Elisha's first miracle, when he struck the waters of the Jordan and they parted, is a reminder that God is capable of making a way even in the most complicated situations. If we are facing barriers in our lives, Elisha's example teaches us to cry out to the Lord and trust that he can make the impossible happen. Furthermore, Elisha's story teaches us about the importance of obedience. Naaman's healing in the Jordan River, who initially hesitated to follow Elisha's instructions but was healed when he finally obeyed, is a reminder that obedience to God, even when we don't understand the reasons, always brings blessings and results. In today's world, where hurry and the desire to do things our way are common, Elisha's story invites us to reflect on the importance of following God's guidance with confidence. Another crucial point in Elisha's story is his ability to act with compassion and generosity. He healed the land of Jericho with salt, restored the life of a child, and multiplied the widow's oil, always acting with a heart focused on the well-being of others. In a world where competition and indifference often prevail, Elisha is an example of how we should live with a spirit of service, caring for others, and seeking the common good. Elisha's story is also a reminder that God is in control, even when we don't see an immediate solution. In times of crisis, such as the siege of Samaria, where the people were on the brink of famine, Elisha proclaimed God's provision. And just as it happened in his time, God is still capable of bringing provision and deliverance today, often in ways we can't predict. In short, the relevance of Elisha's story in today's world cannot be underestimated. He remains a model of faith, courage, and dependence on God. His miracles, teachings, and attitudes invite us to live with unwavering trust, reminding us that, just as God worked powerfully in the past, he still works miraculously in the present and the future for those who trust in him. As we look at Elisha's life and deeds, we are invited to reflect deeply on our own faith and obedience to God. His story is not just a chronicle of miracles and extraordinary feats, but a testimony of an ordinary man who, in responding to God's call with courage and dedication, became an instrument of transformation in his time. The lessons from his life challenge us to ask ourselves, are we willing to follow God with the same commitment, trust, and willingness to act in his name as Elisha did? Elisha did not just witness miracles. He was the channel through which God demonstrated his power and love to the people of Israel. His miracles, like the multiplication of the widow's oil or the healing of Naaman, were not just signs of divine power, but clear declarations that God cares about the details of our lives, from our material needs to our deepest spiritual concerns. These miracles still have something to teach us today. God continues to perform miracles in the lives of those who surrender completely to him. As we reflect on his life, we are challenged to ask ourselves if we are willing to let go of what holds us back, just as Elisha did with his former life as a farmer, to faithfully follow God's call. Are we willing to act in faith, even when circumstances seem difficult or when others around us doubt? Elisha shows us that true faith is not a faith that depends on circumstances, but a faith that trusts unconditionally in God's power and promises. Furthermore, Elisha invites us to reflect on the importance of our legacy. He did not live for himself, but to fulfill God's purpose in his life. Just as he passed the mantle to Elisha, we are called to pass on our faith and the lessons we have learned to future generations. Elisha's example reminds us that the impact of our lives is not only measured by what we do, but also by what we leave behind, the faith, teachings, and love for God that we can share with others. Finally, Elisha's story challenges us to live with courage, act in obedience, and trust fully in God, regardless of what we face. Like him, we are called to be bearers of God's power, whether in small acts of compassion or in great acts of faith. Elisha's life is an inspiration for all those who seek to live a purposeful life, guided by God's hand. Therefore, as we meditate on Elisha's legacy and the impact of his life, we are called to reflect on our own walk with God. May his story inspire us to respond to God's call with the same courage, faith, and dedication, knowing that God still performs miracles in our lives and that his power has no limits. Revisiting the life of Elisha takes us into a deep moment of introspection. His journey was marked by miracles that defied the laws of nature, but also by a life of faith, obedience, and courage. Elisha didn't seek personal glory but served a God who used his life to impact nations, heal the afflicted, and restore what was lost. His example is undoubtedly a light for those seeking to live a life dedicated to God, regardless of the adversities that may arise. Reflecting on his life invites us to ask, how have we responded to God's calling in our own lives? Elisha, a simple man from an ordinary family, was raised up to be a great instrument in God's hands, reminding us that it doesn't matter where we come from or what our circumstances are. What matters is the willingness of our hearts. Once we respond to God's call with faith and readiness, God can do great things through us. Elisha also teaches us about the importance of having an obedient and faithful heart. In a world where people seek quick answers and easy solutions, the prophet Elisha challenges us to trust God radically, act with courage in the face of difficulties, and be obedient, even when the steps to take are not clear at first. His life teaches us that sometimes the key to a miracle is our obedience, as seen with the healing of Naaman, who initially resisted what was asked of him, but upon obeying, experienced healing. Elisha's legacy is not only of miracles, but also of teaching and transformation. His willingness to act in God's name, serve others, and live with integrity is a model that transcends time. What he did and what he taught continues to be relevant today, showing that God's power is not limited to a specific time or place. He still acts powerfully in the lives of those who surrender to him, believing that miracles are not just something from the past, but something that can happen in our lives today. Finally, the story of Elisha reminds us that, as servants of God, we are not alone. He continues to guide us, sustain us, and empower us to fulfill his will. Elisha's miracles reveal God's heart, a heart willing to bring restoration, healing, and provision. And like Elisha, we are also called to bring this message to the world, sharing the hope that God's power is available to all who believe. Now more than ever, we are invited to reflect on our role in God's plan. Like Elisha, we can be agents of change and witnesses of divine power. The life of Elisha is not just a story from the past, but a living inspiration for today. May we learn from his example and seek to live with faith, courage, and obedience, trusting that just as God used Elisha to transform his world, he can use us to transform ours. We've come to the end of this incredible journey through Elisha's life, a man of unwavering faith and an example of obedience to God. May his actions and miracles inspire us to trust even more in divine power in our own lives. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave your comment below. We love hearing what you think. And of course, like the video to support us and share this message with more people. If you haven't subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. We have much more inspiring content coming your way. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring more stories of faith and transformation.